Hello everyone, good morning. Sharing my screen. We've created the HR web application. And we did add CRUD pages yesterday. So this is how the application is looking like. In two-thirds space, we are displaying the list of employees in a tabular format. We have added the CRUD functionality, and we are displaying the data in a graphical format as well. So the first thing that we do is, what if we have to generate additional pages apart from the create, read, edit, or delete pages? Can we create it explicitly? We can certainly do that. So we'll see how to create one standalone page and how to navigate to it by clicking on a button from here. Okay, so we need to, let me just open up a previous application. It's not displaying the data there. So what we want to do is we want to, we'll try to add a new page called statistics page. And in that statistics page, let's try to display maybe a bar graph in there. We'll create a new page. And we would go to that new page by clicking on a stats button. So we'd put a button called stats on top of the table. And when we click on it, application should navigate us or take us to another page called statistics page. And in that statistics page, we want to display a list of employees in a tabular format. Maybe we would display a list of employees or count of employees by department in as a bar chart. Okay, so it's not going into the statistics page as such. Yeah. So if you click on the stats button, it should take us to a new page where it should print a graph. I think it's a connection, and this is a little unstable. It's not getting displayed here. So what we do is we go back to our application, and under employee flow, you see that there are two new pages that were added. For delete employee, we don't have a page getting created. We don't have page created. We create a new standalone page, and let me call this as statistics page. And I'm creating this page explicitly, not using quick start option. And what is it that I want to do here? I want to call it as employee department summary page. And I want to display a bar graph here, just as an example. And remember, in the case of department business object, we have got a total EMS field, total employees field that we have added on the department business object. And remember, we have an aggregation logic in place for this particular field. So we said always keep this field up to date with the total count of employees in a department. And in the case of x-axis, you put a name, and you can display the total employees itself as a color series. Now, the moment you do that, what would happen? You see a graph getting printed, and you can fine tune it a little bit. Maybe change the titles accordingly. Instead of just name, call it as department name. And you call this as total employees field. And how does user navigate back from this page? We can add a button. Let's say we want to add a back button. Let's call it as back. And you can change it to call to action. And when this button is clicked, what is it that you want to do? You want to take the user back to the previous screen, right? So you go to the button event and you go ahead and add a new OJ action event here. And you can call it as back button action chain. And from this action chain, I just need to perform only one action. What action do I want to perform? I want to navigate the user back to the previous screen. I can drag and drop it. And sometimes, even though it is added here, you might not see the node getting reflected here. If you refresh it, you get to see it. You see a navigate button is added now. Now, yes, we created this page displaying the list of employees, so count of employees by department in a graphical format, and we also have a back button as well. Now, how would user access this page? There should be a way for user to come into this page in first place, right? So what you could probably do is on the employee start page, you add a button, call it stats, and you go to events, OJ action, call it as stats button action chain, and you can call a REST API here. And what REST API, sorry, it's not a REST API, we'll be dealing with REST APIs later on. In fact, in the next application, we'll be focusing exclusively on the REST APIs. Let me delete this, I don't need this. And what is it that we wanted to do from this one? When somebody clicks on the stats button, what is it that we want to do is, we want to navigate. So you have these options showing up here, and you have the same navigation option showing up here as well. Under navigate, you see 3 options here, and the same 3 actions also available here. So I say navigate, and to which page we need to navigate to? Employee stats page. So when anyone clicks on the stats button, navigate them to the statistics page. Launch the application. And you see a statistics button, click on it. It should take you to a stats page, and here you get to see the list of employees or count of employees by department. And you see that there's only 1 employee in sales, none in marketing and IT. Now, remember this total EMS field, we have an aggregation logic in place, right? If you go to employee, sorry, not employee, department business object, you see total EMS. What is the aggregation logic we have? Count of employees. So since we have aggregation logic in place, VBCS will keep updating this field automatically. So what I can do is, if I go back and update a couple of employees and put them into marketing, let's see what happens. I'm updating Chris. Let me put him into marketing. Dave, marketing. Now you go into stats button. And what do you see here? You see that the number of employees in marketing is showing up as 2, sales 1, and none in IT. And remember who updated this total employees field, guys? It got updated automatically. VBCS updated it automatically because you have put in aggregation logic there. So this way, apart from the CRUD pages, you can also add standalone pages to your application and add routings to those pages by putting in buttons on the landing page. Now, another important point for you to remember here is two things I want to talk about here. First important thing, after you generate the pages, sometimes you might want to make some changes onto the page. Let's say you added this create employee page, and these are the fields that you have selected. Let's say tomorrow client asks you to add one more field here. Okay, what do? In such case, since the page is already added, adding a new field to a page you have to basically follow a specific process for it. So if you have to add a new page here, new field to a page, what do you need to do? You just have to go into create employee page, and you see a page designer. And here you see 5 fields. And instead of these 5 fields, you need to add one additional field, right? So where do you add that one additional field? So you have 5 fields at the moment. And where would you see those 5 fields? Remember when we added the create employee page, we selected these 5 fields. So what VBCS will do is, with those 5 fields, it would have created a data type. It would have created a data type with those 5 fields. And it would have created a variable of that data type. You see create employee request is a data type that was created with 5 fields. And a variable was created of that data type with those 5 fields. And when you hit the save button here, what might be happening? All those 5 fields are being passed as input to create employee rest endpoint, and the employee is getting saved. So if I want to add a new field here, what do I need to do? I need to go into data type first. And you should not use add field here. Instead, you need to say edit from endpoint. And these are the fields that I have selected on the create employee page. And if I want to say save a manager as well, if I want to add this new field called manager as a Boolean object onto this one, or you want to add a job, what do? You select it, you pick a field, it gets enabled, added to the list. It would be added to the data type. Now, since we added a new field to the data type, it would be added to the variable by default, because this variable of that is of that data type. Now, what do you need to do? You go back into page designer. And if you want to receive input from a user for that particular field, what you can do is you can add in an input text field, onto the page. And what is it that you call it? You call it as job. And you need to bind this UI component, whatever user types in here, I want it to be saved onto the job field. Now, how does the mapping work? If you look at any UI component, salary or any field, go into data tab, you see that this field is binded to employee salary attribute. There is a variable called employee on the page, and in that employee variable, there is a salary field. So whatever user enters in here, it gets stored in that salary field, in that salary attribute. And I want to do the same thing here or similar thing. So I go into variable employee, I bind this UI component to the job, so that whatever user types in here, that would get saved in the backend in the job table. So this is how you can add a new fields to the pages that you have already generated. Very often you run into the requirement, and I get questions from students like, I already created a page, correct pages. I've also fine-tuned them, added a lot of other functionality. Now there is a requirement to add a new field. How do I do it? Of course, one obvious way is you can recreate the create employee page, but that would ensure that, what does that mean? That means you have to plug in all the logic again. So instead of doing that, you can go to the data type, add the field, add a UI component, bind it to the fields, bind it to the new field that you have added. Okay, this is one thing that you need to be aware of. And another thing that you need to be aware of is, as you build complex application, this is not a complex one, but once you start building complex applications, sometimes application might not work as expected. Sometimes application might not work as expected. What do you need to do in such case? In such cases, remember the VBCS application will write quite a few details to a developer console. So a browser is where you access a web application from, and a browser would have, if you go into more tools, you see developer tools. And within the developer tools, so here you have an option. You can erase everything. Just give me one moment, guys. Just give me 2 minutes, guys. Yeah. So what VBCS would do is, since it's a web application, anything that happens in the application, right, all the details will be written to this developer console. Now, how do you come to this developer console? In the browser, you click on this options, go into more tools, and you see a developer tools there. So if you go into developer tools, you see a console there. Now, whatever happens within the VBCS application, it will be written here. Now, say, for example, if I pick up a specific employee, what happens? This particular employee, remember on the table, there is a first selected row event, right? Now, if you see carefully what happened here, right? So you would be able to see that the selected ID variable, if you scroll up a little bit, you see the selected ID variable that you have. That selected ID variable has been assigned a value of 1, which is the employee ID of C. So whatever exactly happened in the background has been captured here. First of all, on the table, first selected row changed event is fired. And there is an action chain attached to this. In that action chain, what is it that we are trying to do? We are assigning this employee ID variable to a selected ID variable. And that is exactly what you see here. Assign variables. Yes, selected ID variable is assigned a value of 1. Now, you don't need to understand each and every line in this console log. When would this be helpful? Sometimes what happens, you plug in complex logic into action chain and it doesn't work as expected. And if you want to know which of the node is failing, in such cases, this would come handy. Okay, just give me one moment, guys. Apologies, guys. So if you see here, when we start building complex action chains, right, especially you would be doing it in ERP, AR invoice application. If it is not working as expected, this console log would help you to figure out easily why it's not working, at what node it is failing. Okay, these are the two things that you need to be aware of. And we've created this application, right? It's a web application. Now, what is the next step? Our next step is, the next step in the VBCS lifecycle is to release this VBCS application for testing. Now, the application would be in development state by default. So when you build it, it would be in development state. Now, we want to release this application for testing. And after testing, we can make this application live and release it for end users. Now, how do I release this application for testing? I can do it by staging the application. So the application is in development state at the moment. And this application is in development state at the moment. We need to stage the application. And how do you stage it? You click on this menu option and you say stage. And when you stage it, what would happen? There would be a URL generated. When you stage it, there will be a URL generated for your application, because at the moment, the way you access this application is you get into the application and you click on preview. Of course, you cannot ask the testing team to get into VBCS, open the application and click on preview, right? So that's why when you want to release this application for testing, you stage it. And how do you stage it? To stage it, we have to click on this menu option and select a stage option. Now, when you stage the VBCS application, what would happen? You get two options. Remember what we noticed earlier. When we created this VBCS app, it created a new schema, right? It created a new schema or user in the DB. Business objects were created as tables. Business objects were created as tables and fields were selected as columns, right? Now, when you try to stage the application, a VBCS would create a new schema. And in that schema, the three tables that you have in the development schema would be created in there. Now, when you're staging the application, it asks you two things. Okay, boss, I'll create a new schema and stage the application. But do you want me to copy the data from dev schema to that dev schema tables to the stage schema tables? Do you want me to copy the data or no? Clean database or populate stage with your data? Now, along with these two options, you also need to be aware of something else in VBCS. So in VBCS, yes, a typical application would have at least a few business objects as a data source. And those business objects can be categorized into two sections, or can be put into two categories, the business objects. Some of them would be related to transactions and some of them would be setup related business objects. So in case of this application, you can think of employees as a transaction business object. But in the case, you see the departments and the locations, you can think of these two business objects as setup related business objects. Because remember, for me to create an employee, I should be in a position to put it in a department, right? I should be able to put him into a department. So how do I do it? I open up an employee record. And so employee can be treated as a transaction in this case, whereas department and location can be treated as setup related business object, because to create an employee, you need to have departments and locations. Now, in the case of AR invoice web application, let's say you have invoice and invoice lines business object. Those business objects will store the transaction details. But to create an invoice, you need customer, you need payment terms, you need transaction types, you need business units, currencies, a lot of other business objects would be required. So all those other business objects, which basically store a setup related information in a VBCS application, on those business objects, you have to enable this checkbox called contains application setup data. I've enabled it on department and I'm also enabling it on location. I won't enable it on employees. Now, what would happen if we go back to the application now, try to stage it again. Now that we have some business objects where we mentioned that they contain setup data, if you say clean database, no data will be copied from development to stage. Sorry. We've already enabled it, right? We have enabled a department and location. Yeah. Now you click on this menu option and try to stage it again. You should be seeing a different option here. Let me come to VBCS again. It is saved 1 minute ago. Let me try to stage it again. No, this is not the message that you should see. So ideally the message that you need to see here is, even though you say clean database, remember there are some business objects in this application. There are some business objects in this application where you have enabled this contains application setup data checkbox, right? So you have enabled it on locations and departments. Now, what would happen when you enable this checkbox on a specific business object, like I enabled it on location and department? And when you do that, irrespective of the option you choose here, so it doesn't matter whether you say a copy data or don't copy the data. Even if you say clean database, our data from our departments and locations business object will be copied over to stage schema, even though you say clean database. If you say populate stage, all 3 business objects get copied. If you say a stage with a clean database, even though you say clean database, those business objects which you have marked as setup related ones would get migrated, or the data would get migrated. And that particular feature would be helpful, especially when you make applications live. We'll talk about it again in a moment. So we are trying to stage the application to release it for testing, right? So when we release the application for testing, we usually populate this development or stage schema data with development data so that the testing team can see at least a few transactions that we used for unit testing purposes. So you say populate stage with dev data, stage it. Can ignore that, just cancel it. And you see that application is staged now. Now, when you click on stage, you see that there is a URL generated. Earlier, if it is in development state, you don't have a URL, but the moment you stage it, you would be able to see a web URL generated. And when you click on it, it opens up, it launches a web URL. Yeah. So if you, so we have this URL generated. It's a stage schema. The moment we stage it, there is a URL generated, and that opens up here when I click on that. So what is it that you do? You would be passing on this URL to the testing team. So you ping the testing team and you say, boss, this application is ready for testing, and use this URL to test it. And what would the testing team do? A functional testing team or a client testing team, they would access your application with the help of a URL, much like you are accessing OIC or ERP cloud instance, right? So in a similar fashion, they would open up a browser. Let me just sign out from this OIC instance from this browser. And what would they do? They would try to access the application, your VBCS application, by or with the help of a URL. And when they access the URL, they would be redirected to a login page. And yes, we would be creating a testing team also as users in IDCS, but we would be using them, assigning them a role like a service user, not a service developer or an administrator. And once they log in, yes, they would be able to, once they log in, they're able to see the access the application. They would do an end-to-end test. They would figure out what's going on. So they will test all the CRUD functionality, look at the details. They check all the functionality in the application. And since it's a UI development, right, you cannot get everything right in a single go. Unlike an integration or unlike a approval process in PCS, VBCS takes at least a few iterations. So you release the application, they come back with 10 UI related changes, you fix them, you send it back. So it goes back and forth a number of times at least. So let's say a testing team doesn't like the shortcuts and they want to see this button as statistics, a small change, just to help you understand how you redeploy it, how you make changes and redeploy it. So we need to change this button label from stats to statistics. How do you do it? You go back. Once you've got that feedback, you go back to your application, employee start page. Select the button and change it to statistics. Now, when you do a preview of it, you can do a preview to see if it is working as expected or not. And you can also verify if the functionality is still intact. You can also verify if the functionality is still intact and click on statistics. You're able to see it's working as expected. Now you go back and ping your testing team, ask them to test it again, ask them to refresh the application and confirm if they're able to see the change. Would they be able to see the change, guys? Not really, right? Because you have done the change in your application in the code, but you didn't redeploy this. You didn't restage the application after you make some changes. So for a testing team to be able to see the change that you have done, what is it that you need to do? You need to restage the application. So we go ahead and restage it. And when you restage it again, apart from clean database, remember this is the message that I was talking about earlier. So when you say clean database, even though you say clean, the business objects which are marked as containing setup data will still be deployed from dev to stage. If you say replace stage, all data gets copied over from all the business objects. Stage with clean database, only departments and locations get copied over because they are setup related ones. And since the application is already staged, we are seeing one more option which says keep existing data in stage. So what does this mean? This means our data in the business objects will not be changed, only the UI related changes would be deployed. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I say keep existing data in stage. The application would be deployed again. And the moment it is deployed, you ask the testing team to verify the changes. And if they refresh the URL at their end, they don't need to change the URL. If they just refresh it, they would be able to see the changes, just like the label changed. And they will test it, send further feedback to the developer, and we make further changes and we restage it. So this goes back and forth at least a few times. And once the changes are freezed and the testing team confirms that yes, application is working as expected, we will take the application one step ahead and go ahead and publish it. And when you publish it, what would happen? So you click on the menu option and say publish. And when you publish it, the status of the application would change from stage to live. And when we publish the application, usually, when we publish the application, you have two options. You could either publish it with a clean database or include data from stage. And the last thing you want to do is your end users to see the testing transactions. So when we are making application live, we never ever copy the data. So we usually publish it with a clean database. And imagine if we don't have that application setup data checkbox, what would happen? If we don't have that setup data checkbox, when we say clean database, application would be deployed and we release it for users. And users would try to create an employee or an expense report or an AR invoice. But when they click on the drop downs, say for example, when they click on the department, they don't see any data. And when they click on transaction type or a customer in AR invoice application, they don't see any data. So, and what we cannot also copy the data from stage, because that when we say copy a data from all the business objects, it copies the data from even the transactions as well. So whatever employees are there, they get migrated, or whatever invoices were there were created for testing for in the testing phase, they get pushed to the live application. So there should be a way to migrate only some of the business objects which are related to setup data, and that is where that little checkbox that we have seen will come quite handy. So even though we say clean database, whatever business objects you mark as contains application setup data, they get deployed. So in this case, I'm saying clean database and I publish it. Since department and locations are marked as contains application setup data, they get deployed. Now, once application is published, what would happen? There would be a URL generated. And how would that URL look like? In that URL, you will have a live keyword. In this URL, you have a live keyword. If you compare these two URLs, what is the change that you see, guys? In case of 1.0 version, you see 1.0 here. And in case of live version, you see a live keyword. This is the only difference. Okay, now you're going to live version, and here I don't see any employees here as expected because I didn't copy the data from stage. But when I try to create a new employee, going to department, I should be able to see the departments. Why departments got migrated even though we say don't copy? Because we mark department as a business object that contains application setup data. So if you create an employee, it should get saved or leave that as well. You see the employee gets saved and it works as expected. So this way, especially think of this from an AR invoice or an expense report or a travel request standpoint. It makes more sense. So when you release the expense report application, employee, when they log in, they wouldn't see any expense reports and they would start creating their own. And in a similar fashion, they would start submitting a travel request or an AR invoice creation request from the application. Okay. Now, let's say you have released this application for end users. And these three stages, right, that you do, releasing it for testing by staging it and then making it live, you can do it in every instance if you want. But we usually take the application until stage in dev and SIT, and only in UAT we also publish the application and release this application for end users, because only when end users test your application you get the real feedback. And let's say you made your application. So after you have built your application, let's say you need to deploy this to higher instances. How do you do it, guys? You have created it in dev instance and you need to move it to SIT or UAT instance. You have to export it. And when you export it, it creates a zip file. You could say export with data or without data, whatever you wish. I say with data, and that creates a zip file. And all I have to do is use that zip file, log into SIT OIC instance or UAT OIC instance, do an import, I say application from file, and I should be able to upload that file that I have exported. Go to import application from file, and you go to downloads. You see this application, UG35 zip file. Open it, and you can give it a meaningful name. You can give it whatever name you want. Okay, so this is how you can migrate application from one instance to another instance. And this is what you do to deploy the application in production. And let's say you have deployed the application in production or UAT, and users have also started using it. Maybe 3 months or 6 months down the line, you would still be asked to make some more changes. The application is already live, but you are asked to make a further changes in the application. So you can close this, it keeps getting imported, or if you you can close it, it would still go on in the background, or if you want, you can wait for a minute and you would see that new application showing up there. Since we have got only one OIC instance, I try to import it into the same instance with a different name, just to show you how it works. You can also close it, refresh it, it should work. And you're able to see that new application here. So this is how you migrate it from one instance to another instance.
So this will be a manual step only, right, for importing the data from one instance to another instance?
That's right. Yeah, manual. Export a file and import it. And that's what you do for all the components, be it integration, a PCS or VBCS. It's just a manual export and import. One file per application.
Okay.
And And here, let's say you need to make some changes in the live application. Okay, let's say you've made your application live and users have started using it. But we've got a change from our users this time after they use the application for a month or couple of months. And what does this say? They say that they want to see this button label as stats. Okay, just a minor change. Now, what do? The moment you get back that change, yes, your application is already in live state, but you might think that, hey, it's a small change, I know how to do it. You try to get into the application and go into page designer. Now, what do you see here, guys? You see that application is in live mode by default. A design button is disabled, meaning you cannot make any further changes.
So we need to again stage it and then do the changes.
Yeah, just let me complete. I'll be explaining the same thing in the next 10 minutes. So when you go into a live mode, in the live mode, so you see that the application is in live mode here, right? And when I click on the statistics here, so when I click on statistics, it opens up, the application starts behaving as if you are accessing a live application, and the design button is disabled. Now, what does the message says? Page designer is in read-only mode because application has been published. So once you publish an application and once application status is live, you cannot make any further changes in this. You cannot make any further changes in it, and you don't even see an option to stage it. Now, how do you make a changes to a live version in such case? You create a new version of it. And you can create it as 1.1 or 1.0.1, doesn't really matter. And once it is created, you go into that 1.0.1, make the change, and this follows the same life cycle that we have seen earlier. Go to statistics. change the button to stats. And you take this application or take this new version through the same life cycle again. Go ahead and stage it, release it for testing team, because the testing team needs to confirm whether it's working fine or not, and you populate stage with development data. And this time what would happen? A new stage URL gets generated for version 1.0.1. And what is it that you do? You pass on that new stage URL to the testing team. So this is a new URL that was generated. And you pass on this new URL to the testing team. And if you compare this to the previous URL, the only change is, since we have version number in the URL, it was 1.0 earlier, now it is 1.0.1. So the testing team would test your application using this URL and they confirm if it is working fine. And once they confirm that yes, it is working fine, what is it that you have to do? You have to publish this. And before you publish any version which is already live, before you republish it, it's always a better idea to take a backup of it, keep an export or do an export and keep a backup of the live version. And then you go ahead and make a previous version, the newer version as a live version. So you go ahead and publish it. And since there is already one version of this application in live status, you get three options: replace data, publish application with clean database, or keep existing data in live. As long as you say keep existing data in live, it's fine. And this is exactly what you need to do. If you select replace live data or publish application with clean database, whatever transactions you have in that live database would be lost, live schema. So that's why even if you select option 2 or 3, VBCS wants to really make sure that you understand the impact of it. So if you select 2 or 3, clean database or a replace live with stage data, until you select this checkbox, I understand that my live data would be lost, the publish button doesn't get enabled. And when we republish the application, we should always retain existing data in live and go ahead and publish it. And what would happen? 1.0.1 would become live now, and 1.0 version would be marked as obsolete. 1.0 version is marked as obsolete, 1.0.1 version is marked as live. Now, if you click on the live URL, just to see if there's any difference in the live URL, would there be any difference in the live URL, guys? Absolutely no difference, because you have a live keyword in there. So it doesn't matter which version you make live, the URL doesn't change, and it makes sense as well, right? Does it look appropriate if we go back to users every time and say, hey boss, you used this URL to access the application last time, now use this URL. So that's why a live version of an application would have a single URL. You don't have a version number in it, unlike the stage URLs. Any questions so far, guys?
Yeah, if I do the changes multiple times, like if suppose I have done 10 times changes, so in the history, 9 times it will be obsolete, and the 10th one or the latest one will be the live one.
That's right.
Okay. So is there a possibility where we can go back to the previous version? Suppose out of 10 versions, I want to go with the 8th version.
You cannot go back any number of versions you want, but if you can go back to the previous live version if you want. Okay. And you can also have a backup of it if you want.
Okay.
Any other questions, guys? Okay. In tomorrow's session, we will build a new VBCS application, and in that application, we'll focus on how to use REST APIs as a data source. Yes, Rita.
Yeah, Prasad. So one small question. So when we are developing this and trying to give it to the testing team, right? So in that scenario, you might not have the same instance, especially when you have these custom tables or objects, right? So where does it create these objects or tables when you launch into a testing instance?
So in that test OIC instance, let's say you deploy this application to a dev instead of dev, let's say you deploy it to SIT OIC instance or UAT OIC instance.
Right.
Now where would those tables be created? In that OIC instance, you have VBCS, and to the VBCS, there is an ATP schema attached here or database attached. So whatever database is attached to the VBCS in UAT or a test instance, so in that instance, that VBCS application, what is the tenant database that is used? In that tenant DB, the schemas get created.
So the
Okay.
OIC instance itself will be different for each.
Correct, each phase of the project. Yeah, much like you have, see, you have multiple instances for dev, SAT and UAT, right? In a similar fashion, you have multiple UAT or OIC instances as well.
Okay.
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 Yeah.
Thank you.